Let me go to, okay, there we are. Thank you all. Thank you for setting this up, Dr. Den, and thank all of you for coming today. I see we have Ben Ariano, who's one of our best operators down at the H2O facility, and we'll talk about that at the end. And I'm really glad to do this for you today. Actually, I have a 1 hour version of almost every slide that I'm going to show you today. So, but what I really want to do today is give you some sense of how all this developed in South Central Texas and how complicated it is to manage water here in Texas. And as it says there, I'm in the operations branch of SAWS, and I've had the good fortune of having been involved in all the water projects San Antonio has done in the last 35 years. But I have this side gig as sort of de facto corporate historian. It's just something I've always been interested in. And one of the things I have down there in the archives is this little brochure from 1924 called The Romance of San Antonio's Water Supply. Now, what other city in the world can you use romance and water supply in the same sentence, you know? But I do think that this is a place where people do have a deep affinity and appreciation for their water here. They know where their water comes from, and they want to do the right thing. They want to steward and protect their water supplies here. And this is different than in most places where they don't even know their water comes from. So we have this really fascinating and colorful and unique water history here, like no place else on earth. I do a whole 1.5 hour long presentation just on the water history here. But one of the reasons our water story is so unique is because our main water supply is so unique. The Edwards Aquifer, this very large limestone formation, this dark blue area here is known as the artesian zone of the Edwards. It turns out you can go anywhere in that dark blue zone. You drill a well, punch a hole in the ground, and you get drinking water delivered to your doorstep. In a lot of cases, under pressure without even having to use pumps. And we don't even have to treat Edwards water. We just add some chlorine to it, some fluoride, and send it to customers. And there's no other city in the world that has been able to grow into going on 2 million people now, relying on an aquifer like this. There just really is nothing else like it in the world. The early explorers and travelers in this area, they described a lot of the springs from the Edwards as being natural fountains like this, sometimes gushing water many feet in the air. This is the only one left I know of that still has this natural fountain appearance to it. This is one of the Barton Springs in Austin, but originally many of the springs in this area look like natural fountains like this. And it's these four. These are the main spring complexes of the Edwards Aquifer, starting up there in Austin with Barton Springs, and you come down to San Marcos and Comal Springs and New Braunfels, and then San Antonio Springs. Now, has anybody ever heard of the White Shaman panel? So maybe some of you have. This is a cave painting in the lower Pecos region out in Del Rio Comstock area. And this painting is 4,000 years old. And the natives in this area, the Indians, believe that one of the functions, one of the purposes of this painting was it served as a map or a guide that they would use to go on a sacred journey to visit the fountain springs of Central Texas. They believe that these four, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but these four black dots that are connected by this squiggly line that represents water, those are the fountain springs of Central Texas. And if you lay that portion of the painting over the aerial, it fits pretty good. So they're pretty good geographers for 4,000 years ago. And what they told me was that back then, if you could, once or twice in your life, you would try to go on this sacred journey to visit these places. So a few years ago, I had an artist paint me these places as they might have looked to a group that's on this sacred journey 4,000 years ago. This is the San Antonio Springs. This is the blue hole that's on the grounds of Incarnate Word campus now, how it might have looked 4,000 years ago. This is how it looks today. It's surrounded by this concrete octagonal wall here. It doesn't flow very often. The Edwards has to be pretty high for this spring to flow. The Edwards here is about 700 feet below ground, but it does flow sometimes, still a very sacred site to the Indians. They still do ceremonies here. There's a lot of other springs up there in the basin, small ones like that and big ones like this that are almost as big as the Blue Hole. So it's the combined flow of all those springs up there that historically were the headwaters of the San Antonio River. And that's why the city is here. That's why people have been using the springs here for 12,000 years that we know of. And there's something else in this painting that I had the artist put in, and it's very subtle, but it's this line of trees in the background. And we did that to try to convey the notion of a managed landscape or maybe a forest garden. And this came out of a bunch of work that was done on the Mission Reach about 10 years ago. They took out 8 miles of concrete ditch, and it was all re-landscaped and replanted into something more naturalistic. And while they're doing that, they found 3 areas down there where it looked like people had been living there permanently. And this was a surprise to all the archaeologists and historians, because you always pictured the natives in this area as, being small transient bands. So there's this new emerging view among the archaeologists and historians that we probably underestimated the number of people that were here. And what they were doing is they were managing the landscape. And really this applies to all of North and South America. They had learned over thousands of years how to manage their landscape in a sustainable way. And that's why we did that line of trees, to suggest that they were managing it. So with plantings like that, oops, and with fire, here's a controlled burn on the Mission Reach. With plantings and with fire, they were managing the landscape, the riparian corridor. Of course, the irony is, 4,000 years later, how are we managing the river corridor today? With plantings and with fire. So, I think we can learn something from them about how to manage our resources in a sustainable way. And that's what we're trying to do at SAWS, is the same thing they did, is learn how to manage and steward our water resources in a sustainable way. But back to this Edwards thing for a minute. These are the primary zones of the Edwards: the contributing zone, the recharge zone in the light blue, and the artesian zone in the dark blue there. And so most of the recharge water that goes into the Edwards is going in the ground out to the west of us, Medina, Uvalde County. And for the most part, the uses out there are still irrigation, agriculture out there. And then here in San Antonio, we are the main pumping center from the Edwards Aquifer. And then these natural spring flows occur out here to the northeast. And I'm going to come back to this. I want you to try to remember this distribution of users from west to east, with the irrigators in the west and the springs in the east. I'm going to mention this again later. But I don't want you to think of this water in the Edwards as some sort of inert substance. I'm sure you guys know that, water is a very powerful chemical compound. There was this internet joke some years ago about these scientists that were going to introduce or announce the discovery of this new chemical compound, dihydrogen monoxide, that has all these dangerous properties. Well, it's water. So, and water is very powerful. It's known as the universal solvent. And you could sit back and roughly calculate how much limestone is being dissolved out of the Edwards every year by water, because rainwater that falls is actually a weak acid, which will interact with the limestone of the rock and dissolve it out. So I calculated this one time, and roughly a pile of rock about that size compared to Alamo Stadium is being dissolved out of the Edwards every year. So it's actually getting bigger as time goes on, can store more water. Well, for 4 or 5 decades, everybody knew that the Edwards was very prolific, produced a lot of drinking water, but everybody knew that it's not infinite. There is a limit to how much it can provide. And so for 50 years, the future water supply of San Antonio was going to be this system of interconnected reservoirs. And none of these were ever built. And the issue was, if you're going to build a reservoir today, most of the controversy is going to be about environmental things. And there was some of that back then, but most of the controversy was about cost, because this is water you're going to have to treat. You don't have to treat Edwards water, but you are going to have to treat this. And it's going to cost, 15 times as much as Edwards water. So every time one of these proposals came up, the residents got sticker shock. And the short story is none of these were ever built. This is a cartoon from 1984 about San Antonio's lack of water supply. And, the city became the butt of endless cartoon editorial jokes about its lack of planning for water supply. Here's the city water supplies this old broken down truck in the way of this Mack truck of growth that's coming. And this perception of the city as a do nothing city, frankly, it was well deserved. They hadn't done anything. And this perception really persisted, I think, until the late 90s, when SAWS started to, bring other water projects online that I'll talk about here in a bit. But one of the drivers for everything that we have done or do at SAWS now, it turns out to be endangered species. In 1991, our whole water world down here changed. There was a federal lawsuit filed to protect the habitat of endangered species that live in those springs in New Braunfels and San Marcos. You got your blind salamander and fountain darter and others. And the idea is that if San Antonio pumps too much, then these springs will go dry and these species could die out. So there was a federal lawsuit filed about that. And back then, there were no limits on Edwards pumping. You could pump as much as you wanted. There were no regulations on how much you could take from the Edwards Aquifer. And something else happened in 1991. This was a real watershed year. This famous catfish farmer guy, Ronnie Puchek was his name. He came to town and he drilled what was at the time the world's largest water well. And he was running this water through these fish tanks to grow some bait fish and catfish. And he was using as much water as 1/4 of the whole city. And so this is where the well was in Southwest Bexar County there. And it was a dry year when the well came in, and it was blowing out rocks the size of basketballs, and the news helicopters are buzzing around looking at this, and people are saying, is it legal for him to do that? And the answer was yes, it was legal for him to do that. And so you see these flow paths of the Edwards that go from southwest to northeast. The city realized at that time that we actually didn't have any water. We thought we did, but we didn't have a drop of water, because it was legal then for somebody to go west of town and drill a big well field and take the water before it gets to San Antonio. And so I actually did some work for Ronnie Puchek back in the day. And I can tell you that he could have cared less about catfish. He was a finance guy, and he had foresight. He saw that someday the rules were going to have to change. They were going to have to limit Edwards pumping. And when they did that, they were going to have to pass out water rights to people that had been using the water. So what he wanted to do was put his thumbprint on some water that he could later sell. And that's exactly what he did. He ended up selling his water rights to SAWS for about $30 million. But that was the event that caused it was like a psychological turning point for the city when we realized that we actually didn't have any water. And this is also about the time SAWS was formed, because all these issues were coming to a head, and it was clear that the city was going to have to really get in the business of developing and managing water. So SAWS was formed from the merger of these three agencies in 1992. And so the short story on the endangered species lawsuit is they won. And that's federal judge Lucius Bunton. He ordered the city to reduce its pumping on the Edwards and to start developing other water resources. And I also did some work for him. I worked a little bit on the management plan that he imposed there briefly. And I can tell you that he didn't want to do that, because it meant that the federal government would be in control of the Edwards Aquifer. And what he really wanted was for the state to act and to solve the problem on its own. And so the state did. It formed the Edwards Aquifer Authority, and it gave the EAA the power to protect and manage and conserve the Edwards, and to pass out water rights to people like Ronnie Puchek, who had been using the water. And like I said, he ended up selling his for $30 million. So at this point, we have a cap on pumping from the Edwards to protect the endangered species. And so for the most part, we know how much water is available and how much we can get from the Edwards Aquifer. So it's fair. I told you I was going to come back to this. It's fair enough to ask, why did it take so long? Why did it take 100 years to get regulation of the Edwards Aquifer? Well, everything about water in South Central Texas always comes back to geopolitics. Where you stand depends on where you sit. So remember that the farmers are in the east, and the flow paths go from the farmers are in the west. The flow paths go from the west to the east. So if you're a farmer out here in Medina, Uvalde County, they knew that as long as it rained in the hill country, they're going to have water under their land. Nobody can touch them. So they didn't want regulation. Why would they want regulation, right? And I've always felt that if this situation was reversed, if the farmers were in the east with the last chance at the water, then you would have had regulation 100 years ago. Because the farmers have one of the strongest lobbies of the legislature anywhere, and so they pretty much get what they want. And so if they had the last chance at the water, you would have got regulation many years ago. So like I said, for the most part, we know how much we're going to pump from the Edwards. And then the other side of the coin, the other question is the water quality. So we can pump it, but is it good enough to drink? And here's where there has, in my opinion, we're behind on this, I think, on protecting the Edwards Aquifer for water quality. My brother, Carlos Guerra, he was a newspaperman. He would always print this in his column: the Edwards Aquifer does not filter the water that recharges it. And I'd call him out and say, Brother Carlos, you know that's not really true. Why do you print that? And he'd say, well, I got to put things in the most simple terms for people. And I'd say, well, look, just show them. That's on the left there. That's water, recharged water going in. I collected that sample from Helotes Creek while water was going in. And on the same day I was going to Austin, I stopped at Comal Springs and took that sample on the right. Well, that's not the same water. So something is happening there. So you can call it, he said it doesn't filter water. And you will still hear the agencies say that today. The Edwards Aquifer does not filter water. Well, so what is happening there? I mean, that's not the same water. What it is treatment. And I had been studying the Edwards Aquifer for many years before I got in the business of water and wastewater treatment. And my office, this is our biggest wastewater plant. My office is right here, by the way, since 1989. But when I started learning about wastewater treatment, I realized there's all these parallels between what we do at the wastewater plant and what must be happening in the Edwards for us to get drinking water out of it. At the plant, this is raw sewage. At the plant, it's mostly a biological process. We use organisms and bacteria to purify the water. And in the space of about 24 hours, we produce water that's almost drinking water quality. So I don't want you to think of the Edwards as cold, wet limestone. You got to think of it as a living system. I had been thinking about this, how the Edwards does treatment, and this hotshot scientist was brought to town by the EAA one year to give a lecture, and I wrote this down when he said it because I hadn't heard anybody say it before. Microbiology is the big missing component in aquifer science. That's the thing that everybody has overlooked. So the Edwards is the average, I forgot to mention this, the average residence time for water in the Edwards is on the order of about 200 years. So there's lots of time for bacteria, microorganisms to consume the organics, stabilize the water, and purify it. And almost nothing is known about how that happens. And so there are plenty of good PhD dissertations out there on how the Edwards does this natural treatment of the Edwards of the water we get out. Now, it takes a real water geek to still have your news clippings from 1973. And I do there on the left that this was when I first started getting interested in the Edwards. There was this controversy about a developer that wanted to put in really a whole new city of 80,000 people over the Edwards Aquifer out here near Helotes. And in the end, the judge said, well, that's okay. You've complied with all federal and state laws, so yeah, it's okay, go right ahead. They never built it because it was really the economic downturn of the 70s that caused him not to build it, but it was okay for him to do that legally. And then a few years later in 79, there was this big controversy over building a super mall over the aquifer. This was going to be at 1604 and 281. And the citizens were outraged by this. They drafted a referendum and they voted this down 7-1. And then the Supreme Court of Texas said that the citizens could not overturn a city council decision like this. They had already zoned the land to approve so the mall could build. They had already zoned it that way, and the Supreme Court said the citizens, they couldn't overturn that. So they got the go ahead. They never actually built that mall either, but they built a similar mall at La Cantera at 1604 and 281, or I-10 in 1604, which is also over the recharge zone. And you see what's over the recharge zone now at 1604 and the 281 out there. It's all built in. So, you know, after those battles, the people here realized that really we can't get there through regulations protecting the Edwards Aquifer. The best tool we have in the toolbox is to just buy the land. And so that's what the landowners have always said. They said, look, if you want my land to protect your aquifer, well, then you can just jolly well buy it. And so the citizens here, they voted 4 times to tax themselves to buy sensitive tracts of land to protect the Edwards Aquifer, like this site here, the Crown Ridge Canyon Natural Area out there by close to I-10 Camp Bullis. That's it right there. And right here on the left, this right here is that right there, development going in. So that's what'll happen if the citizens don't just flat out buy the land. Now that tax was in place. Like I said, the people taxed themselves 4 times, and then just recently that tax was shifted to other priorities. And so the buying of sensitive tracts of Edwards land is not as robust as it used to be. It's still being funded to some extent, but I know a lot of my friends in the environmental community, they were really disappointed when they didn't get the chance to vote on renewing that tax for a 5th time. So but when we talk about protecting the Edwards Aquifer, really it's more than just the recharge zone. You always hear about, oh, well, we got to protect the recharge zone, but you don't forget that the water that's going in the Edwards in the recharge zone is coming from the Edwards Plateau, and it's coming, from Bernie and Bandera. So it's what's happening up there that affects the quality of water going into the Edwards. And guess what? Those people up there on the Edwards Plateau in the hill country, they don't use the Edwards Aquifer. They use the Trinity Aquifer. So they're sitting up there saying, now wait a minute, San Antonio, for 40 years, you've allowed unfettered growth over your own recharge zone. And now you want to talk about regulating my land to protect your aquifer. And it doesn't go over very well. So that's why I'm dragging this back to geopolitics. Once again, there's always these geopolitical concerns in doing anything about the Edwards. And if we were going to regulate the Edwards for water quality, there's this question about who would do it. And it's not clear who has the authority, if anybody, to regulate for water quality. If you're going to regulate that way, you'd probably want to use this map we've seen several times, that those are Mother Nature's boundaries, the hydrogeologic boundaries. But the EAA only has jurisdiction in this area. Same way with TCEQ. And you've got all of these other conservation districts and planning areas that overlay on top of this, and cities and counties in addition. So, and each one of them has some level of say-so about what happens. So how do you bring all that together, to regulate this area for water quality? I'm not sure. That's one of the big questions that's out there. And it's made even more complicated by this. We have these two legal regulatory frameworks in Texas for groundwater and for surface water. Groundwater is owned by the landowner, and surface water is owned by the state of Texas. And there's a different regulatory permitting system for surface water. So I've drawn the pathways here by which rainwater can get to the ocean. And in the green lines, that's groundwater that's owned by the landowner. Surface water in blue is owned by the state of Texas. And so the same drop of water changes ownership several times before it gets to the ocean. And I'm here to tell you that it's all the same water. And this is a very challenging environment in which to manage any water resource, because you've got these two regulatory legal frameworks that you have to deal with. So someday in Texas, we might get to the point where we have, conjunctive management of groundwater and surface water, but we're not exactly there yet. Now, I only had to put in a couple of more lines here, and I've drawn the complete hydrologic cycle, which I'm sure you heard about it in 6th grade. But for water planning in Texas, historically we had what I call the hydroillogic cycle, which starts with apathy, nobody cares, and then you have a drought, which results in panic, and then it rains. And so historically, all the water plans in Texas were done after an extreme drought, when people realized we have to do something. You go back to the early 60s up until the early 2000s, and that's how it was done. It's better today. What happens now is the state is divided up into 16 planning regions. We're in Region L. And so every 5 years, the stakeholders in Region L, each one of these regions, will develop a water plan for that region. And then those 16 plans become the state water plan. So that's better than how it was done before. It's still not perfect. It's still controversial. What do you do when the water supply that one region is planning to get is from another region, and those people don't necessarily want their water to leave that region? So it's not without controversy, but it's an improvement over what was done historically. Now, when all of this came down, when the judge made his ruling and it was clear we were going to have to, develop and manage water here, the first thing that SAWS did was build a recycled water system to take treated water from our plants back up into the city for reuse. It's the biggest recycle system in the country. We've got about 70 users on it. The Alamo itself uses it on their grounds. The Toyota truck plant uses about 1 million gallons a day in their painting shop. One of the reasons they came here was because we could offer them this recycled water. And, this is all about conserving, reusing water so we can conserve Edwards water and not pump so much. We also use this recycled water to supply the San Antonio River up there by the Blue Hole, because they don't flow very often. We have a discharge there. This is right near the convention center. And so a lot of people don't realize this. On a dry weather day when it's not raining, almost all of the water in the beautiful San Antonio Riverwalk comes from our plants. This is why a sewer guy like me gets involved in San Antonio River stuff, because we supply the water down there. So next time you're at Casa Rio restaurant, you can tell your friends that water was flushed about 2 days ago. And like I said, we treat it to almost drinking water quality. The other thing that San Antonio did very early on was aggressive conservation. And if you were here, I know none of you were, but if you were here in the 60s, 70s, into the 90s, this is what the whole city looked like. Everybody had a big green lawn. Water was almost free. It was so cheap, it was almost free. And, we ran through the sprinklers at 3 in the afternoon, and that's just the way life was. Well, we've shown people now that you can have a pretty nice landscape without using a lot of water. This is my house in Helotes. I'm coming to you from behind this upper window here, and I don't really use very much water. I mean, at SAWS, we don't tell people you can't water, because yeah, people want to, preserve their trees and their landscape during a drought. It's just, being reasonable and making sure that you're using as little as you can and conserving it. And so we've shown people that you can do that. This is our trend in per capita water use of this is gallons per person per day. Starting back there in the early 80s was 225 gallons per person per day, and we're down to 110 last year. And people ask me, well, how much water has SAWS saved? And I say none. It's the community, it's the ratepayers who have done this. They have, because like I said, they want to be good stewards here. They get it. They understand our water situation, and they want to do the right thing to protect and manage our water. And so they respond to our calls for conservation and incentive. So really most of the credit goes to the people who have in the community who have, felt like they needed to be good stewards of their water. This is all the water that we've delivered to customers so far every day in 2022. And you see this this sawtooth pattern that develops in the summertime here, where you've got these dips. Those are weekends. And you see this because during the water restrictions we're under now, there's no watering on the weekends. And so you can see there's this huge hump of water that is all outdoor discretional water use. And that's why you see SAWS focusing today more on outdoor water use than in the past. We kind of have done the indoor thing. We gave away 500,000 low flow toilets. It's this outdoor discretional water use now that's driving this peak demand. Our maximum this year was 336 gallons in 1 million gallons in one day. And as an operator, as like Ben has, he has his finger on the mouse button that turns on the pump. And when you're in operations, the number here that's important to you is the peak. It's the maximum, because in the water business, you cannot fail. The pipes have to stay pressurized. This is not like electricity where you can have like a rolling blackout. And so what this means is I got to have everything. I got to have the water supply, the pumps, the pipes, the tanks, everything in place to meet that peak demand one day of the year. And the rest of the year, I have a lot of infrastructure that I don't use very much. That's very expensive. So to the extent that we can drive down this peak demand, we can save a lot of money on pumps and pipes and tanks. And so I mentioned this because, people like to frame conservation as an ethic, something that you should just do to be a good steward. But there's also this economic argument for it that is just as good. Like, we want to drive down these peak demands in the summertime because it can save us and the community a lot of money. You can send signals about conservation through rates. And we do that. This is our rate structure at SAWS. So it starts out very cheap. If you're using 3,000 gallons a month, you're paying $1.80 for 1,000 gallons. But then the next tier, the next increment of water gets more expensive, and so on up the chain. And part of this is there's an equity question here. If you're the one that's causing that outdoor discretional water use peak, in the summertime, then maybe you should be the one that pays for most of that as well. This is a receipt that I bought on eBay for $4. And that's exactly what Mary Menger of the Menger Hotel paid for this in 1891. She paid $4. It says there, for the privilege of using a hose to sprinkle. She wanted to water her husband's burial plot. And on the back, it's got a long list of restrictions. It says you shall not suffer a hose to run freely. You may not prop a hose in the crook of a stick. And so my point here is that the idea that we're going to charge people more for outdoor water use, it's nothing new. They were doing it in 1891. It's just something we're now getting back to after 130 years. So after we did recycled water and conservation, we like to brag that we have developed all of these other water supplies today. This is all the places that we get water from in this year. And 20 years ago, the whole pie would have been green. We had no other supply except the Edwards Aquifer. And today we have all these other sources. And this is the reason why when the Edwards Aquifer Authority, for example, recently they went to a stage 4 water restrictions. Well, what that means is that the pumpers, their stage 4 doesn't apply to you as a consumer. It applies to SAWS as a pumper. It means that SAWS has to reduce its Edwards Aquifer pumping by a certain percentage. Well, we can do that because we have all these other water sources. So we didn't have to ask our customers to go to stage 3 or 4. We stayed in stage 2 because we can meet our cutbacks by using these other sources. And 3 of those sources, I'm almost at the end here, but 3 of those sources are down there at our beautiful H2O Center where Ben works. And I want to briefly talk about those 3 down there on this one site. The first one that we developed there in 2004 was aquifer storage and recovery. When the judge made his ruling about limiting Edwards Aquifer water and they passed out water rights, the way it works is SAWS and other pumpers, you get so much water that you can pump per year. But if you don't use it, it doesn't roll over to the next year. It's not rollover minutes. It just goes away. So our thought was, if we could find a place to store Edwards water during the rainy years when we don't need it, we could store it there and bring it back during the dry times. And that's what we do here. This is what water in storage looks like. We have the right geology down there. It's a sand aquifer where you can store a lot of water. We have about a 10-month supply for the whole city stored underground here today. And it's worked out real great for everybody. We just leased the property right back to the landowner, the previous landowner, and he's still doing what he always did. He's running cattle, a little bit of agriculture. And so a lot of people all over the country are looking at this kind of technology. This is far superior than building a surface water reservoir, because when you do that, the water evaporates and it's exposed to contamination, all those things. You don't have any of that when you're storing the water underground. The second water source we have down there is we're producing and treating water from the Carrizo Aquifer. This is an aquifer where the water does require treatment. And so we adjust the pH and the alkalinity, and if there's any iron in the water, we remove it. And with all of our water sources, what we have to do is we have to treat them so that they match the chemistry of Edwards water. The first rule of water treatment distribution is that you never mix waters of 2 different chemistries. So we have to make sure with all our water sources, the idea is that we're going to make them all look like it, just like Edwards water. And the idea is that you won't know the difference. And we also do that, for good reasons, like you don't want that Flint, Michigan problem. What happened there was they introduced unstable water into their distribution system. And remember I said that water is a very powerful chemical compound. Pure water is not stable. You need minerals, calcium and magnesium in water to make it stable. Otherwise, it will demand minerals from whatever it comes in contact with, like pipes. And so what happened in Flint, Michigan was this aggressive, unstable water started to leach out lead from the pipes. And that turned into a bad situation. So here we're very careful. I know Ben down there, they test the water frequently. One of the things they look at is stability. Is the water stable, which means that it's neither scale forming or aggressive. And then the third water source we have down there is our desalination plant. This is coming from very deep underground. there's a whole ocean of slightly brackish groundwater down there on the Gulf Coastal Plain, and nobody's ever used it. It's just a little bit too salty to drink. It's, you know, too salty even really to use as cattle swill, but it's nowhere near as salty as ocean water. And so it doesn't take much to, you know, to knock down the salinity in there to where you can use it. And so what Ben and the operators down there do is they run this reverse osmosis, which produces a very, very pure water, which is very aggressive. And so then they have to stabilize it. They have to add calcium back into it so that it matches the chemistry of Edwards water. And like I said, we do that with all our water sources. I think this is my last slide here. So I did a presentation like this for a Rotary Club, and afterwards a lady came up to me and she said that she was the finance director at USAA when this article came out. And she said it was a real conversation they had. USAA, who is the biggest private employer in San Antonio, they were having a conversation about whether they were going to stay in San Antonio because they didn't have any confidence in the water supply here. So we do feel like all this water planning has done good things for San Antonio. The USA is still here. But we brought on a water project called Vista Ridge 3 years ago in 2019 for 50,000 acre feet of water from the Carrizo Aquifer. And I think that that's the last water project that we're going to need in my lifetime and maybe Ben's lifetime. He's, well, probably through 2060 or 2070, we are not going to need to develop another water supply in San Antonio. So we're in a much better situation here than most other cities in Texas and in the West that are, especially during this drought that is going on right now. People are really struggling with how they're going to deal with future water supply and shortages. And I think that in San Antonio, we have adequately addressed that water supply question where there's still more work to do, with making sure that it's all sustainable and we can, manage, we want to manage all these supplies for the long term. But I do think that we're in fairly good shape here for our water supply in San Antonio. It has not been easy for all those reasons I outlined, all the layers of jurisdiction, the different regulatory legal frameworks you have to work through. What I tell young people that are thinking about getting into the water business is you only need about 2 water projects to make a career, because everything in the water business takes 10 or 15 or 20 years. By the time you do the planning, and you have to then, sell it to the public, and then you have to do the financing and the permitting and the design and the construction. By the time you do all that, 10 or 15 years has gone by at least. So we've done that in San Antonio over the last 25 years, which put us in a good situation today. And that's where I'm going to stop and try to answer any questions.